Hello, everybody. Welcome this Saturday afternoon. Thanks for joining us for our series, Making of Modern Georgia. Um, we are now on our fifth presentation. This week, we're calling it Soviet Georgia and its Legacy on Contemporary Politics. Um, and we're very glad to have two wonderful speakers to join us. And I think it's appropriate. We've got one veteran professor, Ronald Suni, who really has been a pioneer in the field of Georgian studies um, and helped me get into the U.S. field of Georgian studies. I'm very grateful to him. And we have also joining Ron Tamar Keburia, who is a young scholar who's just starting her career. She's at the Leibniz Institute for East and Southeast European Studies in Regensburg in Germany. She just completed her PhD on the experience of Zestapony and the creation of a Soviet working class in the 40s and 50s. So we have both ends of the spectrum. We have a veteran scholar and we have a young scholar together. I'm not going to be doing the introductions, however. I'm going to pass this over now to Malchaz Toria, who is a professor of Georgian history at Ilia State University. Again, thanks to everybody for attending. And I'm going to hand it over now to Malchaz Toria, and he will introduce the guests. And I think it's going to be a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. And I agree. We expect really fascinating presentations and discussions today. The focus on the lasting legacy of Soviet rule on Georgia is a really complex problem, and it profoundly shaped the country's political institution, economic structures, and social life. And today's discussions ask how Soviet rule transformed Georgia and how those historical processes continue to influence contemporary politics and society. So, as Stephen mentioned, to explore these questions, we are joined today by two historians and whose work specifically examine the Soviet experience and the history of the South Caucasus specifically. So, our first speaker is Ronald Grigor Suni, is the William H. Sewell
Second speaker.
Yeah, that's correct. Uh, Distinguished University Professor of History at the University of Michigan, now Emeritus Professor of Political Science and History at the University of Chicago. He's one of the leading historians, and Stephen already mentioned it, concerning the Russian Empire, Soviet Union, and the author of influential books, including, for instance, Armenia in the 20th century, The Making of Georgian Nation, The Revenge of the Past, Nationalist Revolution, and the Collapse of the Soviet Union, Red Flag Unfurled, Historians, the Russian Revolution, and the Soviet Experience, and recently Stalin Passage to Revolution, as well as many other important works, co-edited volumes too. He is currently finishing a new book, Forging the Nation, The Making and Faking of Nationalism. I would like to also mention key aspects of his biography because it's really, as Stephen mentioned, is veteran in this sphere. He has received numerous awards, served on the editorial boards of several academic associations, and held leadership roles in scholarly organizations, including serving as president of the American Association for Advancement of Slavic Studies. It's a recent appointment, as I understand. And Professor Suni's intellectual interests have centered on the non-Russian nationalities of the Russian Empire, which is particularly interesting for us today, and the Soviet Union, like Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and his work also explores the national question, the nature of empires and nations. And today, he will speak about the ideas of making nations and this particular aspect of the Soviet legacy. Now, I would like also say words about Tamar Keburia, who I know quite a long time, and he works specifically on the economic history of Soviet Georgia, examining the structural foundation of its Soviet era economic model and how those structures continue to influence Georgia's post Soviet development. Tamar is a postdoctoral researcher at the Leibniz Institute for East and Southeast European Studies in Regensburg, Germany. She received her PhD through a joint program between Ilia State University and the University of Göttingen. Her dissertation explores the history of industrialization in the South Caucasus under Soviet rule, which is currently converting into a book manuscript. And how I hope it will be out soon. As a postdoctoral researcher, Tamar is also involved in the project Commodity Frontiers in Eastern Europe, Environment and Societies at Global Risk. And Tamar is also a research affiliate at the Institute of Social and Cultural Studies at Ilia State University, where she is part of the research team working on the project Institutionalizing Modernity in Georgia at the juncture of empire and periphery. Her articles have been published or are forthcoming in Communist and Post-Communist Studies, Caucasus Analytical Digest, and the Russian Review. So what is interesting also here is beyond her strictly academic work, Tamar is also engaged in public scholarship in Georgia, collaborating with documentary filmmakers, hosting podcasts or on resource extractivism, authoring op-eds, and organizing regional and international events. So we are pleased to have both speakers with us today, and I look forward to this discussion. And first, I would like to ask Tamar to go ahead, and floor is yours, please, Tamar.
Thank you so much, Malchas, for such a generous introduction. I think right now the slides are on, right? This is how I understand them. Thank you so much for having me here. It really means a lot to be part of the Georgian Association in the US discussion series, first of all, and the work you are doing in promoting Georgian culture and raising the awareness about the Georgian affairs, past and present in the US, is truly remarkable. I also have to say, sharing this panel with Professor Ron Sunny is something, a personal highlight for me. His work has meant a great deal to so many of us, whether we are in academia or just simply passionate about the Georgian history. So I'm really honored for this opportunity. With that, let me dive into what I would like to bring to today's conversation of making of Georgian nation, Soviet Georgia, and its legacy on the contemporary politics. And the word legacy, I believe, is a key to today's conversation, and it's doing a lot of work in how we talk about Georgia, and sometimes maybe even too much of work. And that is why I actually somehow titled my contribution More Than Legacy, the Complex Roots of Georgian Economic Structure. And my aim in this rather modest and short contribution will be to critically reflect on the frequently invoked concept of Soviet legacy, a term that has become a catch-all explanation for the challenges that the Georgia's economic and social sphere is facing since its independence. But how often do we actually somehow stop and ask what does really the legacy means here? What does it entails and how does it influence the contemporary politics of Georgia? So that is what I want to unpack in today's conversation. And if we go to the next slide, the second slide, I would somehow highlight in this context that like unpacking is like would be a worthwhile exercise if we somehow zoom out uh, and look at the longer arc of Georgian economic history. And when you do that, four distinct stages in my understanding come into the view. The first stage is Tsarist period, something between 1880 till 1980, a century-long Russian imperial rule across the South Caucasus. And in terms of its economic impact, It was characterized by large-scale infrastructural politics aimed at strengthening the empire's military grip on the region, while also extracting its natural resources in exchange for hard currency. This was the period when the Transcaucasian Railway was constructed, when coal, gold, and manganese mining ventures were first initiated, and when the Georgian military highway, a 210-kilometer road connecting Tiflis to Vladivostok through the Caucasus Mountains, was built. And this were what Bruce Grant, a very interesting scholar, in his seminal work, The Captive and the Gift, calls the gift of empire. Gift that, as he explains it, aimed at a bigger goal of taking resources, taking wealth, but most importantly, taking the national sovereignty of the country. And then comes the next stage, which is often overlooked, I would argue, and this is a brief but remarkable period of the Georgian independence from 1918 to 1921. And during this time, the Democratic Republic of Georgia deployed the modernization and developmentalism as a tool of nation building. And as Professor Sunni himself has written it many times in his compelling writings, this was a moment when the very politics of the modernization at the periphery, at the imperial periphery, became some kind of subversive act, creating, and I'm quoting him here, the conditions for imperial failure. Which he writes in his amazing article, Striking Against the Empire. But as we all know, the Georgian independence was quite a short-lived, and it was brought to an end by Soviet occupation in 1921, sorry. And then came what is known as the Soviet regime, which lasted for 7 decades, and it somehow fundamentally restructured the Georgian economic sphere. An economy that has been mostly agrarian before the Soviet occupation and peasant-based underwent massive capital and labor-intensive industrialization. But this process, of course, but this process of economic and social modernization was quite peculiar. It was driven by socialist ideology under the command economy, and it was aimed at nurturing a new Soviet men and women, a new kind of urban-based proletariat that would eventually become kind of locomotive for building the communist society. Now one can argue at length about how successful or unsuccessful the Soviet project ultimately was, especially in the context of Georgia, and we will come back to this point. But for now, let me name the fourth and, broadly speaking, the last stage of the Georgian economic trajectory, and this is transition to the market economy under the neoliberal model, characterized by massive privatization, sweeping deregulation politics, and what was declared as this kind of complete withdrawal of the state and state institutions from the economic life. And each of these stages, of course, left its own mark of Georgian economic structure. And any serious attempts to really understand where does the Georgia stands today requires reckoning with all these layers rather than somehow narrowing down explanation to the Soviet legacy alone. And next slide, please. So with that context, so with this kind of historical context in mind, let me now turn to the peculiarities of Soviet economic planning and what I mean behind this. Because understanding how it worked in practice will help us to dig into this kind of continuities it maintains within the Georgian economic structure until nowadays. The Soviet system rested on few core pillars. This was the centralized planning, command economy, a drive towards the capital and labor-intensive industrialization, but perhaps the most consequential features was what Soviets called rayonizatsiya, a policy of regional specializations. Each region within the republic was assigned a specific economic role within the large union machine, and Georgia was no exception here. It was embedded into this kind of vast Soviet economic landscape as one small piece of a much larger puzzle. And another peculiarity of Soviet system was that it was fundamentally closed economic system, largely sealed off from the West, and there was no market competition, no consumer choices in any meaningful sense, and production wasn't demand driven at all. Now, the Soviets, of course, did pay some attention to the competitive advantages of different republics and different regions. For example, Central Asia was oriented toward the cotton plantation because of its climate. The Urals became the backbone of steel production. The western regions of the Soviet Union, such as Belarus, Ukraine, the western part of Russia, were developed as an industrial powerhouses for complex machine building production, partially because of their already pre-existing and existing and advanced infrastructure and skilled labor. But because the Soviet Union was so vast, not every republic or region was necessarily assigned an economically logical function. Economic profiles were designed from top and handed down below, which left very little room for engaging decision making to flag the problems or push back by the regional actors. Thus, the result was like system with a high tolerance for the inefficiency and a low capacity for self-correction. And of course, Georgia was not exception in this sense. And if we get to the next slide, I'm gonna try to somehow unpack here what did this mean in Georgian context? How did it somehow play out in practice, right? So, well, this kind of top-down economic planning created a very strong interdependencies between the republics, with almost no room for self-sustained economic viability. Republics were not designed to function as a standalone economic entities. They were modeled as interlocking parts of much larger Soviet whole, each one incomplete without the other. And if we look to this kind of Georgia's export-import graph, here we can see how much Georgia was dependent on other republics. By 1970s, like 1966, as you see in this graph, Georgia was exporting around 30% of its total output to the Soviet republics, while importing around 50% of its industrial consumption from them. Nearly half of the Georgian entire export-import turnover runs through the Russian Federation, Russian Socialist Federation, spanning everything from food and light industry goods to metal and chemical products. But more importantly, this was a partnership of non-equal partners, right? It was a supply chain designed in Moscow, and Georgia was simply one node in it, and it depended on that kind of chain. And if we get to the next slide, I'm gonna talk more about this kind of peculiarity which I mentioned above about this rayonizatsiya. So behind this economic dependence stood, as I mentioned earlier, the Soviet policy of rayonizatsiya, or regional specializations. And it wasn't random. It was deliberate, it was systematic and deeply political. Every republic, every region was assigned a fixed economic role within the centrally planned economy. For Georgia, that meant that certain industries were built, others were never developed at all, and the entire economic structure was oriented towards serving the all-union system, not the locally existing needs. And on this map, which you probably see, but I cannot see it now, but I hope you see it. On this map, you can see this kind of regional specializations on display. Aheti, for example, with its vineyards and traditional viniculture, was positioned as a center for the wine production. Guria, Samegrelo, Ajara, Abkhazia, with their subtropical climates, were designed as the main agricultural contributors, specializing on tea cultivation, citrus plantations, nut groves. Imereti, sitting atop vast coal and manganese deposits, became the industrial epicentrum to the giant ferroalloy factory that would somehow then define the region's fate in the future. So when the Soviet system collapsed, Georgia was left with an entire economic architect that had been designed for the world that no longer existed. It was a very particular set of dependencies, distortions, and half-finished projects. And I'm going to give you an example. If you get to the next slide, this should be a slide with a Gori textile factory. So Gori textile factory is like one good example to showcase how this kind of interdependencies worked. In 1951, Soviet planners built a massive textile factory in Gori, employing over 6,000 workers. And as I mentioned, Georgia was not producing the cotton, important raw material for the textile production, and the raw cotton was shipped in from the Central Asian republics, processed into the textile in Gori, and the resulting product was then sent to the Poland for the final manufacturing product. A supply chain that stretched across the thousands of kilometers by design. Now, fast forward in 1991, the Soviet Union collapses and the Gori factory finds itself for the first time in its history free to make its own decisions. At that freedom exposed the harsh realities. As researchers Levan Lotkipanidze and Ivani Abramishvili, who document the history of this Gori textile factory, they write in their kind of document, in their study, it was like the factory couldn't simply compete with other kind of factories. It failed to meet the international quality standards, and when it tried to somehow upgrade its product to the high quality production, the costs were prohibitive, like too much expensive. And meanwhile, the regional competitors, Turkey in particular, had better technology, lower production costs, and well-established logistical networks. So what happened is that like Turkish textile companies came in and they bought the still functioning machinery, while the rest of it was somehow taken as a scrap. And the Gori was not an alone, kind of not a standalone case, right? In Georgia, we know that during the transitional period, a lot of factories shared a similar fate. Across Georgia, factories shared a similar fate, sold off as a cheap spare parts or cheaper scrap. And that was largely what the collapse of Soviet economic structure, architecture somehow actually looked like in practice in Georgia. And if we get to the next slide, it should be somehow it somehow displays this kind of the graph of Georgian GDP kind of distortion, and what happened to Georgian economy in 1990s is difficult to really overstate. And this graph gives you a sense of why it was like such a severe distortion. What you are seeing is indexed to 1985 and is the scale of economic construction Georgia experienced through 1990s. And this kind of brief uptick between 1990 and 1994 reflects the fast revenues generated by early privatization politics. But starting from 1995, the picture changes sharply. A steep drop of the GDP volume and GDP per capita in Georgian economy was like really harsh, and until nowadays it never fully recovered from that kind of drop. And now it would be too simple, of course, to somehow put this downside of the Soviet economy and Georgian economy in the transition place to the Soviet legacy only. Of course, during this period, Georgia underwent several kind of wars, civil war, ethnic war, and deeply misguided transitional politics. The drive towards massive privatization didn't produce the functioning market economy. But in general, this is my main argument that and this is like a central thing I want to emphasize in today's discussion that it where the real legacy, this is like where the question of the legacy really sits, right? Not just what Soviet left behind, but how that inheritance was handled during a transitional time. So everyone was talking about the freedom, independence, individual rights, and those things during a transitional period was, of course, very important and it mattered a lot. But the question of how people were actually going to survive, what we are doing with these kind of factories of this built during a Soviet time, how to keep the social fabric intact, how to maintain the basic economic performance, we're somehow treated as an afterthought, not this kind of third-rate issues. And if we go to this kind of 8 and 9 slides, these are like my final slides here. I'm gonna be wrapping up soon. We're gonna see a very modern, contemporary kind of statistical data from the Geostat, which is the like, Georgian Statistical Department. And if we pause here, we see this kind of two graphs. The first shows Georgia's external trade between 2022 and 2025. The second breaks down import flows by country groups in 2025. And what jumps out in this kind of graphs is the lingering effect of the Soviet economic structure that is still felt and visible nowadays, right? So, like, let me explain what I mean here. Looking at the trade imbalances on this, like slide 8, indicates that Georgia is consistently importing far more products than it is exporting. And that structural dependency we trace through the Soviet period has continued to exist until nowadays, while today it has a bigger consequences. It makes the Georgian currency lari deeply vulnerable to external shocks and thus turns the question of the global price change, inflation, and tariffs into a very immediate issues that ordinary Georgians feel on their daily lives. And then if we go to the next slide, which shows this kind of export-import by country groups, here again we see that Georgia remains firmly within the economic orbit of the former Soviet space, right? This kind of CIC countries which are like for a larger share of this kind of export shares. Georgia are like former Soviet Union countries, right? Like Russia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Ukraine. These are the main kind of exporters to the Georgian kind of in the Georgian economy. And this brings me to what might be a concluding point of today's talk, that Georgia has lived through a radically different governing regimes, each marked by sharp political breaks and sharp contrasting ideological projects. But one constant thing that runs through its like historical trajectory is this kind of decisive role that Russia as an imperial power played in shaping and somehow molding its economic structure. And to the like final slide, probably this is like a very last slide of from my side. This is like the collection of the suggesting reading materials. If you are interested in the question of the Soviet legacy, you can read from these materials. And with this, I'm gonna leave floor to Professor different aspects of Georgian history, Soviet legacy in Georgian kind of context, from different angle and much more kind of cultural and national questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tamar, for that insightful presentation. Now I would like to invite Professor Suni to begin his talk.
Thank you, Malchaz. And thank you, Tamar. That was an extraordinary presentation. Wonderful. I wish you had been around 40 years ago or so when I was writing my book. I would have learned a lot. And I can say with confidence that modern Georgian history is in good hands in Georgia nowadays. So for me, as I've been characterized as a veteran scholar, I guess that means I'm very old, and I am. It is not only a real pleasure to participate in this important webinar, but to my mind, this is a milestone in the intellectual progress of Georgians and others interested in the modern history of Georgia. For the last 35 years, since the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the independence of Georgia and the other Soviet Union republics, there has been, unfortunately, an erasure of the 20th century history of Georgia. There's been a kind of deliberate forgetting of 70 years of nation making. This national amnesia, of course, is not only something experienced by Georgians, but by peoples of most of the former Soviet states. That forgetting was accompanied by a revival, even an invention of a new national narrative based on conceptions of occupation, colonization, repression by the Soviet center, a continuous national history that elided the social, political, economic, and cultural developments and regressions of the Soviet period. Notably, now in this fourth decade since independence, we've seen a new interest in that experience and a new, I would say, more objective, more neutral, more critical history of Soviet Georgia. One that has emerged without apology or whitewashing of errors and tragedies, but also with attempts, difficult as they are, to move beyond the limits of what was powerful and ubiquitous in the Cold War years of an anti-Soviet, anti-communist indictment of the past. The writing and rewriting of history, of course, is the job of critical historians. And it's a truly difficult task. It's also a noble task and a necessary task in an age when states, including my own now, the United States, are deforming and distorting and falsifying history. And this task of critical historical writing must be carried out both by Georgians and non-Georgians who are people with different experiences and perspectives. And I'm happy to join and have been part of this. We have to avoid nationalist approaches to glorify or to condemn. Now, that doesn't mean that judgments will not be made. Judgments will be made. That's inevitable. But the judgments will be in the service of understanding, of explanation, rather than indictment. So let me begin a brief history, very brief, of the politics and cultural legacies of the Soviet Union on Georgia. These were both positive and negative. The Soviet experience made Georgia what it is today, and it prevented Georgia from being something very different. We don't know what that would have been, but we can imagine it. Let's begin with where Georgia was on the eve of the invasion of the Red Army in February 1921. I would say that of the three South Caucasian states, Georgia was in the best condition to create a viable democratic nation. Armenia was a land of disease and starvation in 1921, threatened by Ottoman Turks and later by the Kemalists. Azerbaijan was a divided state and nation between the Muslims, backed by the Ottomans, and the multinational working class of Baku, which, you might remember, actually welcomed the Red Army once the defeated Ottomans withdrew from Baku. Georgia was different. Georgia was a democratic state, ruled by a popular socialist party, the former Mensheviks, the Social Democrats, who were committed to carrying out what Marxists conceived of as a bourgeois democratic revolution. In other words, Georgia was going to take a different path from what the Bolsheviks were doing in Central Russia. Social democratic Georgia was indeed, by all accounts, a viable, independent, democratic state, admired by Europeans, both liberal and socialist. It was even, for a short time, tolerated and recognized by none other than Vladimir Lenin as a possible independent state. But then several Georgian Bolsheviks, most importantly Stalin and Orjonikidze, organized the invasion and occupation of Georgia. The Mensheviks fled, first to Batumi and then to Paris, and the Soviet Republic was declared. Lenin basically gave in to the Georgian communists, accepted the reality, the fait accompli of the moment. But I wrote in The Making of the Georgian Nation, quote, the revolutions, in quotes, in Transcaucasia that brought the communists to power had not been popular in origins, but imposed by a superior military force. Support for Soviet power in these republics was limited to some disaffected elements and remained for a long time dependent on physical force. The possibility of revolt and civil war was great, unquote. And indeed, in 1924, there was a revolt, insurrection, which was quickly put down. And for the reason of the viability of this Georgian republic and the difficulty of Sovietizing it, Lenin called for caution, compromise, and concessions. And his call was largely disregarded by Stalin, Ordzhonikidze, and their followers. But this invasion was only the beginning of the story. The next chapter was about the strength and determination of Georgian, what we call national communists, to forge their own idea of Soviet development. And that story has been well told. It's known as Lenin's last struggle, or the Gruzinskaya Delo in Russian. This conflict at the end of Lenin's life between Lenin and Stalin over how much autonomy non-Georgian republics would have in the newly formed Soviet Union. Now, the first battle in that struggle was won by Lenin, who intended to use the Georgian case as a bomb, that's what he called it, to dislodge Stalin from his position of power. But Lenin was felled by a stroke, and the ultimate war was won by Stalin. Georgian would be subordinated to Moscow. Its local powers would be limited increasingly over time until it would be dominated by the 1930s by Stalin's loyal satrap, Lavrenti Beria, who would physically eliminate, execute the first generation of Georgian communists, Budu Mudvani, Orakhishvili, Akujava, and others, though not Pilipe Makharaza, who happened to survive. So what's the legacy of that period, of the way the revolution was carried out? The first thing to say is that in order to rule Georgia in the 1920s and 30s, coercion, violence had to be used by the state, by the Soviet state. In other words, politics was not about discussion, compromise, negotiation, consent, as in a democratic state. Politics, as Foucault put it, is the reverse of what Clausewitz said. It's not war as politics, but politics as war. You defeat your enemy, you eliminate them, you dominate, and you use coercion when necessary. In other words, they had not yet achieved what you might call cultural and political hegemony, to rule by example, with authority, with persuasion. They would try to develop that in the 20s, and there's a relatively rapid accommodation to Soviet power after 1924. But very quickly, by the end of that decade, Stalin declared a war against the majority of the population in the Soviet Union, the peasantry, and which resulted ultimately in an authoritarian state of a new type. A single-party state was already there, and the use of terror, right? And the murder of hundreds of thousands of people, including exemplary figures of the Georgian intelligentsia, and the whole old communists, old Bolsheviks, as we say, Staria Bolsheviki, the old generation, the first generation. So Georgia was now fully integrated without much sovereignty at all, no sovereignty, you could say, within an imperial state, which meant centralization of the state, which Tamar beautifully showed in the economic way, in the Ionizatsiya policy. No shared sovereignty. In other words, no real federalization, no real federalism. a pseudo-federalism. This is a peculiar empire, a pseudo-imperial federal empire with all power and decision-making mostly in the center, including the economic decision-making, as we've seen. What this meant under Stalin was a subversion of the Leninist principle of national self-determination. It's not that korenizatsiya and other policies of supporting local cultures and even elites, once they were Stalinized, did not continue. That did happen. But there was no self-determination of how this nation would develop. There was some, of course, because intelligentsias did develop. What there also was, very importantly as a legacy, was the undermining of socialism. That is, socialism is the alternative to capitalism. It was seen as the next stage of history. Socialism, in its original Marxist form, was understood to be complete democracy, working class power, both in the state, in politics, and in the economy. None of that occurred. The working class itself was subordinated to the bureaucratic state. One of the great legacies of Soviet power was there were no real political alternatives to the Communist Party. There was a simple monopoly in this basic state called Stalinism, which was largely coercive, a coercive effort to create a kind of support, legitimacy, and hegemony. Now, those difficult and negative aspects of imperial rule at the same time did create what has to be recognized as a cultural renaissance among Georgians. The very beginning and the difference of a Soviet state to many other authoritarian states, including Tsarism, was their effort to extend literacy. So the country was completely literate by the late 1930s, and largely in Georgian. In fact, compulsory learning of Russian was not demanded in the Soviet state until 1938, on the eve of war, as it became necessary, of course, to create a coherent armed force. And think of how Georgia developed. Novels, incredible poetry that was revered all over the world, and a film industry that was not rivaled anywhere else in the Soviet Union. I had the privilege when I was a graduate student in Tbilisi with my wife Armina to go every week to the film studio and watch 2 films, and to the television studio to watch 2 films. And it was an extraordinary education. Very importantly, another great effect of the Soviet modernization project was the demographic dominance of Georgians in the Republic and in its capital city, Tbilisi, by the 1960s. In other words, Georgia became more Georgian than it had ever been in its history. Though it did remain a multinational state. And yet, one of the legacies of Georgian dominance in the state, dominance over non-Georgians, was a Georgian imperialism. That is, Georgia too acted as an empire, most importantly vis-a-vis Abkhazia and South Ossetia, to a lesser degree toward Ajar. That's a very important legacy, because that legacy, the Beria period and afterwards, the Gamsakhurdia effort to create a Georgia for Georgians, so unpleasant to remember, led to civil and ethnic war, and the division of the state, the entry of Russia, under Yeltsin, by the way, not Putin, and the separation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia from Georgia. The effect of Soviet policy, its form of politics as war, meant a degeneration, a degradation of politics. And the long legacy, particularly in late Stalinism and in the Brezhnev period, of the same political leaders for years and years and decades led to corruption. And Georgia was known as one of the most corrupt places. For me, being a graduate student there, it was actually very pleasant because you lived pretty well. Georgia had more automobiles than almost any place in the Soviet Union. It had tens of thousands of doctors. You didn't want to get sick there in Soviet Georgia because the doctoring wasn't very good. People were buying degrees. So corruption was rampant, but there were lots of mandarini, and we lived very well. The period when I was there was the Brezhnev period. And there's still, in many parts of the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, but not so much in Georgia, a nostalgia about this Brezhnev period. Now, why would people looking back 30 years later, older generation, be nostalgic about the Brezhnev period? Well, think about it. It was a period of stability, of predictability. You knew where you were going, of slow growth, right, for many years, greater autonomy, local rule, a rise of national feelings, social mobility. Georgians in that period became more urban. And again, after Stalin's death, the coercive policies of the regime, the gulag, the terror, they dissipated. The gulag was basically dismantled. And you move toward hegemony. In other words, now the regime had to rule by persuasion rather than open violence. And it had to deliver the goods. If the regime didn't deliver the goods and show that the Communist Party and its nomenclatura were in fact producing something good for the population, there would be possibly revolt. Now, Georgians, in fact, had little regret and still have little regret about the end of the USSR because the losses and costs were so overwhelming, despite the development, the modernization, the literacy, the cultural renaissance, etc. Now, I want to end with something that actually Tamar hinted at that I have argued before, but now applied to Georgia. That is what I call the dialectic of empire. Think about it. We think of the Soviet Union as a failure. But what if we turned that analysis upside down and thought of it in another way? I would argue that deeply embedded in the imperial state policies, and the Soviet Union was an empire, there is a particularly subversive dialectic in the developmental policies of the empire. The very successes of the empire, making people modern, urban, literate, create the conditions for imperial failure. If the developmentalist program succeeds among a colonized people, realizing material well-being, intellectual sophistication, urbanization, industrialization, social mobility, knowledge of the world, the very justification for foreign imperial rule and dominance by a paternalistic ruling party over a so-called backward people simply evaporates. Indeed, rather than suppressing nation-making and nationalism, Soviet imperialism far more often provided the conditions and stimulation for a construction of new nations like modern Georgia. Populations were ethnographically described, statistically enumerated, ascribed characteristics and functions, and they reconceived themselves in ways that qualified them as nations. Not accidentally, the map of the world at the end of the 20th century was marked by dozens of states with boundaries drawn by imperialism, not the least Georgia. And if clearly defined and articulated nations do not exist within these states at the moment of independence, then the state elites afterwards, with great difficulty, will have to busily set about creating national political communities to fill out the fledgling state. So post-Soviet states like Georgia are nationalizing states. They have to make nations within the state. In other words, what I'm suggesting is that we can reverse the usual story of the demise of the Soviet Union as the result of failure, of a faulty ideology. The collapse can be seen as the Soviets succeeding in some ways, only too well. Developmentalism, of course, was not the project in this case of bourgeois nation making and empires alone, but of self styled socialist states as well. Now, the problem grew when the empires, which were justifying their rule as agents of modernity and modernization, as instruments of development and progress, achieved their stated task too well and supplied their subordinated populations with languages of aspiration and resistance, and indeed created subjects that no longer required empire in the way that colonizers claim, but could become now full national citizens. This dialectical reversal of the justification for empire, embedded in the theory and practice of modernization, was, in my view, also at the very core of the progressive decay of the Soviet Empire. In a real sense, the Communist Party effectively made itself irrelevant. This dialectical reversal, embedded in the theory and practice of what's called the mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission, which is at the core of empire justification, was also at the core of the progressive decay of the Soviet Empire. This is a story, the Soviet story, of overreach, of the Soviet Union trying to do too much, of trying to accomplish what was beyond their own capacity to carry out. In part, it's a story of a somewhat unsuccessful transition from coercion to hegemony and persuasion. And in a very large part, it's the failure of a reforming regime to sequence reforms and use its coercive powers as it attempted a transition under Gorbachev to a more democratic polity. In a real sense, then, the communists were not necessary. Who needs a vanguard when you now had an urban, educated, mobile, self-motivated society? Who needed imperial control from Moscow when national elites and their new citizens were able to articulate their own interests, actually in terms sanctioned by Marxism-Leninism in the idea, now realizing it, of national self-determination? Who needs the emperor in Moscow when Georgians are finally able to rule themselves? Or are they? Didit Matloba.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for this really fascinating exploration of this complex dynamics of the shaping of Soviet Union and shaping the post-Soviet Georgia too, because of this legacy. These were really complex kind of dimensions discussed here. Tamar started talking about the economic aspects of shaping this economic, even post-Soviet economic reality of Georgia within the ruptures and transformations, and how this state-planned economy disrupted, but then kind of the late 80s elites kind of transformed into entrepreneurs during the post-Soviet time. So we have short time actually, unfortunately, left. So I have a couple of questions to to ask you, and then if we left time, we could pick up other like one or two questions from the audience. Um, the first question would be like you both emphasize this economic or political and nation-making dimension of the shaping of Soviet reality. Um, to what extent should we understand Soviet Georgia primarily as a part of an imperial center periphery system? You explored already this issue somehow, but I would like to connect it with this. The generally the considering Soviet Union as a empire as such, because there were discussions about what kind of empire was Soviet Union, like affirmative action empire, empire of nations, and kind of, as you suggested, inversing the perspective. It's unlike the British or French imperial experience when there was not so classic understanding of core and periphery model, because imperial subjects were somehow quite active in forming and shaping the Soviet Union as such. But there is another part of this story then when we follow the modern epistemology of the Soviet history, there is a, I think, exaggerated emphasis on agency and kind of diminishing the coercive structure of the Soviet Empire. So, how can we situate this within this model, Georgia? Because we know that the different Soviet republics were different way integrated into the Soviet Union, like in Central Asia, Baltic Soviet republics, the Caucasus. And how do you see this asymmetry of the relations in terms of economic structure and also kind of in terms of political, cultural profiles of Soviet republics, and particularly Georgia? That would be my first question. If you,
Tamar.
Omar.
I think like Professor Suni is more, yeah, in this context, eligible to answer this question. But like what I can say from my economic part, and there is also a really good question, which Malha speaks to your question right now of Professor Suni, Professor Stephen Jones in the Q&A session. And I mean, just to combine these questions on the center and periphery, I think Professor Suni's argument on this kind of, and there is really interesting book by Krista Goff also, who is like, she's also arguing about this kind of nested nationalism, which also reciprocates the same nested imperialism, right? Within the tutelar nations and within this kind of different kind of cores and different kind of parts of the empire, and how this kind of imperialistic logic penetrates different structures and somehow engenders with this kind of power structure all the relationships within the between the nations. But what is very interesting in my case and in question of the economic kind of relationships is the seeing how the peripheral republics itself acted within and had a relationship within each other without the Russian kind of supervision and with this kind of imperial supervision. And this is like very telling example when you look, for example, between the Georgian and Ukrainian industrial workers. And what kind of, like, of course, we know this kind of brotherly nation, all this kind of transparent kind of parts of the friendship of the people, and so on and so forth. But beyond this kind of politics of the propaganda, you actually see some kind of very embedded, strong kind of relationships between Georgian industrial workers and Ukrainian industrial workers beyond the supervision of the Russian Empire per se. And somehow we know a lot, and there has been a lot of studies how the empire and its peripheries related and what kind of relationship they had, but we don't know much how this kind of imperial peripheries somehow bonded, right? And what kind of relationship they have. So maybe this is an important question one should ask. And I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to your question, but probably this is a direction I would start to think about the question you posed.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I'm going to emphasize the one part of your question, Malchus, which was asymmetry. You remember that all through the Soviet period, all non-Russians were called Russians in the West, right? There were no nationalities. Everybody concentrated on Moscow. Everyone was examining the Kremlin, Kremlinology, and we were left out. The only people who studied the non-Russians were emigres who were very nostalgic and nationalistic and anti-Soviet, and my family was not, but this was a different thing. And so when one came into that study, you were marginalized in the profession. And then you begin to study these non-Russian peoples, and you find they're very different, very different. And think about even on the economic level, the Soviet Union's developing. This is an empire that, if you read Alec Nov's book and Neff's book about the Soviet Middle East, that was about developing the periphery. They actually had this idea that they were going to bring the peripheries up to the level of the center. They never quite achieved that. Again, this is overreaching. They were so ambitious to do these things. And when they made their economic policies, there's a good book by Ian Scarborough of Leiden University on Tajikistan, really good book, where he shows that developing the cotton industry in Tajikistan, which was a kind of development and improved the economy of that republic, also made it a backward state because it was now agricultural in an empire where industry and workers were at a higher level. Now, in Georgia was also largely agricultural, but artificially, there was a policy to build a steel mill for no good reason in Rustavi. Absurd. It didn't make sense economically. This Rayenovania or Reanizacija, I think they called it Rayenovania in the 20s, policy was supposed to be based on efficiency, economic efficiency, whereas self-determination and Korenizacija was in conflict with that. Because Korenizacija, these national communists in many republics, they wanted to develop their own thing. And I think Tamar hits the nail right on the head, as we say, in that. Whereas Rayenovania or Rainizacija was about figuring out what would be most efficient for an economy of the whole Soviet Union, which then proved to be disastrous. The example, Tamar, of the Gori textile mill is devastating. I mean, it reminds one of when the British took over India. India had a thriving textile industry. The word calico comes from what the Indians were producing. But when the British established the empire, they destroyed that industry, took the cotton back to England, developed the cotton mills of England, the dark mills, right? And made India a more backward state. So empires have these kind of paradoxical effects on colonized peoples and colonized areas, both of developing and both of regressing, right? One more thing and I'll stop. There's now a fashion to see empires, and for good reason, and colonization as simply negative, right? There's even a lot of work now in Central Asia which talks about medical colonialism. Medical colonialism. What is that? You teach people locally about the germ theory. You teach people in villages in Kazakhstan about hygiene. You actually fight to end malaria. And the Soviets did that. They fought against malaria in Central Asia and got rid of it largely, right? Or lessened it significantly. But that was considered by many historians now as a form of colonization. Maybe I'm a medical colonizer because I think that's not a bad thing. In other words, you have to see the kind of paradox that there was actually development as well as what I'll call de-development or regression, I'll call it. And that's what makes that history so fascinating and so complicated.
Thank you. So I would like to allow audience to kind of ask questions. I will pick up some questions because actually my following questions somehow speak to the questions too. So I would rather give voice to them. So first, Stephen Jones asks you, Tamar, about your insights on Georgian economy uh, between imports and exports, and you link this to the Soviet legacy. But how does this compare with other small impoverished states in the global economy that have had no Soviet past but have similar patterns? That's interesting question because now Professor Sun Yong mentioned that the teaching Central Asians like of medical colonialism, there's a question: what if there was no invasion or Soviet incorporation, and modernity will come, but in other phase? That might be question. And you talked about this, imagining what would happen if Democratic Republic of Georgia remained, something like that. But let's Tamar answer this question, and then we'll continue.
Yeah, and this is like absolutely a legitimate and very important question. I mean how the and this is true, right? I mean, mostly that the small states like Georgia, they do struggle with the export-import imbalances, and poor and small states do have the export imbalances compared to import, right? And this is no exception in Georgian case. But what is interesting in our situation is like how this imbalance is structured. And as I tried to show in my kind of presentation, Georgia still orbits around these post-Soviet countries and somehow has like strong ties to that countries, right? Where the Russia until nowadays plays a huge role in defining and affecting the Georgian economy. So if we also pay attention to this kind of post-Ukraine war after the 2022, Georgian economy really peaked. Its GDP per capita really increased, but this increased on the account of the Russian economy somehow being sanctioned and Georgia being used as a backyard, right? And with this kind of very, how to say, this kind of unhealthy relationship, the Georgian economy becomes strongly dependent with this kind of huge gravitational power, which is Russian economy nowadays. So this is what I was trying to emphasize. But of course, the small countries, the poor countries, they do have an export-import imbalances, but with no industrialization, right? The Georgia had a certain level, certain degree of industrialization, which it was not able to sustain. And this was like all this was somehow devastated and evaporated during the 1990s with this kind of unregulated privatization politics. And this is something that one should really learn. All this politics of deindustrialization that Georgia underwent, this is a legacy that we should be talking about, not the Soviet industrialization, but the post-Soviet privatization. This is a legacy that the Georgian nation and the Georgian country struggles together with this kind of Russia having this kind of strong shadow over the Georgian economy.
The next,
Can I
yeah,
add something to that?
please.
So first
Yeah.
of all, if you don't have the Soviets in Central Asia, you have Afghanistan. That is, we have examples of countries, but of course later the Soviets go into Afghanistan. They invaded Afghanistan because they were actually trying to stop a more radical view and so forth. But the Western states, particularly the United States, prevented that regime, and we got the Taliban. So, there's a complex history. Now, Georgia was not Central Asia. I made the point that Georgia was a viable and democratic republic with problems, because the Mensheviks were also, by the way, putting down rebellions in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, where the Bolsheviks were stronger. So they weren't innocent. There's a whole good story about that. But they were a viable state, and that party was very popular. So that's extremely important. Now, the other point I would want to make is that Georgia, after the fall of the Soviet Union, and the Georgians wanted to be independent. I was opposed to the breakup of and still am, think that it's a disaster that the Soviet Union broke apart. That if Gorbachev had won over Yeltsin instead of the other way around, we might have something like the European Union. At least we wouldn't have Putin, right? It's Yeltsin who gave us Putin. So we have to remember that. There were other possibilities, and there were also other possibilities for Georgia in 1921 and in 1991. But we have to live in the age that we got. We have to live with the legacies that we have.
Yeah, I have to raise the question, which is, I think many Georgians would ask the Mariam Beshidze, kind of ask about the so-called kind of constant trope of about the Georgian imperialism, which Georgians are quite sensitive of, and it, speaking of about it rationally, many would say that it's about coping the Soviet ethno-federal system or replicating ethno-federal system, like, matryoshka structure, like autonomies and center periphery model. So the Mariam Beshizi asked about to Professor Sony, could you please elaborate further on how Georgian imperialism worked in Abkhazia and South Ossetia during the Soviet period? And I could also add that that was a two-way dimension, right? Before Beria, for instance, like Lakoba was quite influential figure who had his own national project agenda. So how can we see these local playouts within the larger imperial structure of, center periphery domination and giving autonomy? How can we explain this local articulation of imperial
Yeah, this is a
system?
very complex, and there's no easy answer to that.
Yeah.
So when the Bolsheviks came to power, there was a big debate in the party. Should we support small nation nationalisms or national identity and Korenizatsiya, which was Lenin's point, or should we reject it because we're Marxists and we're against nationalism, etc.? And Lenin made the most unbelievable extension in this policy toward as much autonomy and cultural development, etc., as possible, within limits, because the whole policy was done during a civil war and in a one-party state. So I've written another paper, maybe I'll give it sometime, about the difficulties of how the Soviet Union moved from this Leninist vision so quickly into an imperial state, right? Now, in Georgia as well, once the state was created, and it was supposed to be a federal state, as was the Soviet Union, on a smaller model. But it was never a real federalism. It was a pseudo-federalism, and the Soviets were dominated. Georgia is dominated from Moscow, and Abkhazia and South Ossetia are dominated from Tbilisi, especially under the Beria period, right? And then discontents and ambitions and national feelings develop. One of Lenin's insights, it's not such a great insight, was that imperialism and colonization fosters nationalism. So he was going to make the Soviet Union non-imperial, though that never quite worked out. And therefore, there was resistance to this policy in Soviet times, in late Soviet times, in the Gamsa-Kurdia period, and we have what we have today. So you may not like the word imperialism. It's not a comfortable word. But, as an American, the most imperial state you can imagine, now fighting this unbelievably disastrous war in Iran, it seems to be the norm of our new century?
Okay, unfortunately I think we ran out of time, and there's other questions. So maybe we one last question about Stalin's legacy and how Stalin as a symbol affects Georgia today. What do you think about it? And let's conclude, because Stalin deserves specific place explaining the legacy and its impact on current social and cultural and economic processes too in Georgia. What do you think? And let's conclude on this matter.
Tamar, do you want to go for that, or?
As a poor Stalinist, I'm gonna give the floor to you, Ron.
I'm not a Stalinist. I'm an
No, it's
anti-Stalinist,
like
but
Stalin
I
scholar.
know, I know.
Yeah.
But I am a Marxist, right? And I have always believed that we can do better than capitalism. So I celebrate the 1917 and the effort of ordinary people to create something better than what they had. It, ni получилось, as they say in Russian, right? There's a famous joke about Lenin that he said, "Мы хотели строить советскую власть, но не получилось." So, не получилось. That's very important. And one of the reasons, and this is something I worry about, and we're writing the second volume with my friend Louis Siegelbaum of the Stalin book, we're trying to deal with. How did this experiment in popular direct democracy in 1917 turn so quickly? Okay, in the course of World War I, Civil War, Revolution, state collapse, etc. How did foreign intervention? How did it turn into a tyranny? Right, and it's a very, very difficult question. But choices were made, and Stalin made choices. In the 20s, he was a moderate, he was for NEP, etc. By 1928, he made a radical shift to the left, adopted the policies, strangely enough, of Trotsky and Preobrazhensky, and used them with force, coercion, and terror to create a new kind of state, which we call Stalinism. So those were choices. Stalin was, and I put in quotes, великий человек. He was a great man, with the sense that he did great, incredible things. He transformed this country, I think, in a negative way. He also was a war leader, and he led, after the invasion by Hitler, the effort against fascism. Stalinist Russia was, Stalin's Soviet Union was the anti-Soviet power up to 1938, and then again after 1941. And we should never forget that it was the Soviet Union that defeated fascism and made the world safe for democracy and Western capitalism. We should never forget that it's the Soviet Union that ended the Holocaust by liberating the camps, including Auschwitz, in January of 1945. So these are great achievements. And yet, he created a tyranny, what people like to call a totalitarian state, that then Khrushchev and Brezhnev and others tried desperately and failed, ultimately Gorbachev, to extract this country from, and ultimately it disintegrated.
Malchus, can I step in here?
Yes, please. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I think we have to end this. We do have an allocated time, so I'm going to thank all three of you for a wonderful discussion. Very provocative, Ron,
Did you
but
expect something
but
else?
but very welcome. I mean, this is the sort of we should be open to these sorts of questions and different perspectives that make us think again about the whole experience of the Soviet Union and its relationship to Soviet Georgia. So I want to thank you all. Tamara, yours was extraordinarily revealing presentation as well about the regional policy of the Soviet Union, how it impacted Georgia. So, and Malchus, good chairmanship. Thank you very much. So I
Thank
think we
you.
have to leave here. Let me just mention that we are. It's as you can see, we have another of session on how Georgia survives as a small state in the modern world, which we will be discussing on March the 28th. So I would encourage you to register for that discussion. And we have again a wonderful group of speakers on that. So look out for information about that. You can go to the Georgian Association site. You can find details about the program. And again, we are voluntary organization. We do our best for new Georgian immigrants and also for Georgian culture and history, making it more visible, especially in these times. Please go to the site and see where you might be able to help. Again, I want to thank everybody. It was splendid, and I really appreciated it. Thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank
Yeah, it
you.
was great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.